Welcome back to the Hot Dish. This is Heidi Heitkamp, and today my special guest is one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, Libby Schneider. Now, full disclosure, Libby was my campaign manager in 2018. She's been involved in electoral politics in North Dakota, literally for her age, for years, working with our Senate candidates, working with our House candidates, and working with a very special candidate, Ryan Taylor, who ran for governor. Libby also ran his campaign. But after 2018, we sat down, Libby and Tessa, my former chief of staff, and I, all North Dakota patriots, and said, we just cannot continue to keep losing in rural America, and what can we do? As a result of that conversation, we formed One Country Project, but we also said, the DNC needs to be more engaged in rural America. They need to be speaking to rural America, and we need to coordinate Democrats in rural America. And so I was thrilled when Libby said she would be interested in that position. And so Liberty Schneider from Fargo, North Dakota, is now the rural director for the Democratic National Committee and has been doing fabulous work. Welcome to the Hot Dish, Libby.
Thank you, Senator. So good to be here. Longtime listener, first time guest.
Very funny, very funny. That may show your PBS leanings.
Maybe. It's good to lead off
Yeah,
with your biases, though.
yeah. Well, listen, Libby, why don't you tell us what's been happening with your rural project over at the DNC, and kind of how you're going to make sure that this isn't just a one-hit wonder and that we continue the work that you started.
Sure. So I think before I do that, I want to make sure people know sort of how you mentioned how you, me, and Tessa got to this point after watching, counties in North Dakota that had voted for Democrats historically over decades get redder and redder over the past 10 years, and sort of how we came to our own moment of reckoning where we said we have to stop the bleeding or we're not going to win races. So I think 2016, anyone who read the news realized that Democrats had a problem in rural areas, and in order to win, we needed to right that ship. And to be very fair to the Clinton campaign, the rural demographic's been trending away from us since 2008. So my boss, DNC Chair Tom Perez, and other party leaders and electeds representing rural areas like you recognized that. And so we set off to work to try to build back some of these relationships between our party and folks living in the rural areas of our country. So it was pretty clear when digging into the numbers that we weren't going to be able to convince the majority of rural folks, or maybe even that 10%, to all of a sudden see the light in our party. But there was an obvious pocket of voters, folks who voted for Obama and then Trump, many of whom lived in rural areas, that made the most sense to target. So anyone who's heard me give a public presentation on our efforts, and Heidi, you've heard it more times than you would like to admit, I'm sure, but you've heard me say this, it's worth repeating that we don't have to win in rural America. We just have to lose by less. And those can make the differences, certainly in statewide elections and in presidential elections. There was actually a headline from The Economist at the end of September that said, Democrats doing less badly among rural voters. And it might as well have said Libby Schneider wins $30 billion by the way I reacted to it. So it's a lower bar, and there's small margins that we need to cut at, but that I think has the biggest impact to make a difference. So we've been working our buns off since I arrived at the DNC, and before my tenure year there too, to make sure we aren't taking one thing for granted as it relates to the rural vote. And that's included, we started making investments into rural America right away in 2019, and built a rural program with many of our state party partners, particularly in the battleground states, that allowed for rural organizers in places paid organizers haven't been for over a decade, in states like Colorado, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Montana, Florida, North Carolina, and you get the idea. But the goal was to be able to hand over a fully formed, coordinated campaign, fully formed campaign structure to whomever the nominee was going to be. And a big part of that was making sure we were building up rural infrastructure. So when Joe Biden became the nominee, we were able to do just that, and have been working really closely with them on rural issues ever since. And I think the sort of concerted effort from the DNC to put money where our mouth is on rural and fund organizers and rural directors. And then also make sure that we're doing our best to use our incredible surrogates like you and other folks from across the country to get the Biden plan for rural America out there and to show that not only is President Trump terrible for rural America, but most importantly, you have an alternative, and it's Joe Biden.
Well, I think some people would say, well, this is lip service. You kind of got bullied into it by people like me who said the DNC needs to pay attention. And I think Tom Perez has been incredibly receptive to the discussion. But how do we, not necessarily turning right away to what happens after the election, but how do we better describe rural America to our Democratic friends who don't live in rural America? By that, I mean, I think when people think rural America, they look at polls of farmers and they say, oh, all is lost. Look at all these farmers. They aren't going to vote for us. And they don't realize rural America is much more diverse than just agriculture. It's not just about farmers. It's about rural healthcare workers, rural teachers, people who run small manufacturing concerns. So how do we help the country, or certainly the people in the Democratic Party who come from places that aren't rural? How do we help them better understand what the concerns are of rural America and build a bigger and better coalition?
Sure. Yeah. To your point, I think it's easy for folks who are in the Beltway to look at a poll that says 75% of farmers are going to support Donald Trump and write off rural America. Well, we know that, as you said, rural America is not. It's certainly well known for agriculture, but just because you're in rural America does not mean it's synonymous with agriculture. So, 1 in 5 people in living in rural America are people of color. You mentioned the manufacturing, and we've seen our rural numbers support for Trump just completely erode in manufacturing states like Ohio and Michigan. And so it's sort of stressing the diversity of this community. We're from North Dakota, certainly where we are, it's mostly in rural areas, it's mostly rural white people. And then, of course, our native brothers and sisters on their sovereign lands. But the rest of the country is a little different. And so I think one of the big challenges I had when coming to the DNC, and I think they were self-aware enough to recognize this, is that in addition to winning back trust in rural America, trying to build those relationships back, we also had to make the national brand a little less toxic for Democrats. And nobody understands sort of the implications of running as a Democrat in a red state where it doesn't matter if you're Mother Teresa, if you have a D next to your name, it's over. And so, sort of fighting with the internally in a kind way, of course, to make sure that we're talking about rural America when we talk about healthcare, when we talk about jobs, when we talk about that we're not just using rural America as a talking point with rural broadband, for example, which I know is something that drives both you and me crazy when that's the only rural talking point. But I think we had an education piece as part of this role, and I think people are starting to get it. At least it feels like that.
I jokingly tell people that it used to be when you went to Iowa, all you said was ethanol, 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 check the box for rural America. And the one thing I've been so impressed by Joe Biden's rural America plan is the depth of understanding about the challenges. And when people say, what's the one thing you want to talk about with Joe Biden's plan? I said, this is going to seem really small to you, but it tells me he gets it. And that is that in his healthcare plan for rural America, delivering rural healthcare, he talks about transportation. How many times, Libby, have we heard grandma couldn't get to the doctor because there wasn't anyone there to take her? The fact that we can offer transportation assistance so people can do the preventative work that they need to stay healthy is just so important. And so I have just been so impressed by Vice President Biden's Rural America plan, because it's not just broadband, check the box, ethanol, check the box. It's talking about real challenges in healthcare, real challenges in education and delivering a high quality education product, real challenges for small manufacturing concerns and infrastructure needs, whether it's roads or bridges. We just have I think, a great plan, and it's just so great to see that when Joe Biden got done with his debate, was the first thing he did. He went and visited places Democrats haven't visited for quite a while. And so I want to turn not to just to this campaign. Oh, well, maybe I think maybe some listeners would be curious about how is it going with your rural project in swing states, Libby? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of reducing margins in places like Iowa and Minnesota and Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan? What are you seeing?
Sure. So I think before I go to that, I want to tell you a little story that you probably remember. You talk about transportation being critical to rural healthcare, and just to show like how nuanced this issue is. I remember being at a meeting with you somewhere in central North Dakota, and this was during the oil boom, and the trains were stacked up, two to a track and back to back, and would be stuck on the track because there was too much train traffic. And this community's hospital was on the other side of the train track, and because there was no underpass, for hundreds of miles, they had to go around or wait for ambulances to get across the tracks. And so, just thinking about that and talking about how seconds and minutes save lives. Especially for elderly populations living in rural America, something as sort of simple as realizing that a lack of an underpass can mean the difference between life and death. These are very nuanced, interconnected issues, and everything is just a little harder in rural America when it comes to access to healthcare. So, but that point aside, I to talk a little bit about the battleground states, which are the ones you mentioned. We have focused a lot of attention and resources into these rural areas, particularly in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Iowa, and a little bit in Florida too, into the rural areas, to make sure that we have now virtual boots on the ground to help to move those numbers. So what we're seeing, and I don't have a crystal ball, and I think we're all naturally and appropriately skittish to sort of make predictions post 2016. But I will say this: we are closing those huge rural gaps. We are cutting those margins down, and particularly, I mentioned it earlier, but in states like Michigan and Wisconsin, and even in Iowa to some extent, these we're talking big movements and closing those huge gaps in rural America for folks voting for Democrats. So we're not, you're not going to see on election night us winning the most rural counties in Michigan, but you are going to see that instead of losing by 25 points, we're maybe losing by 9, and that's going to propel Senator Gary Peters to reelection victory. We're going to propel Biden to the White House, and all the great congressional races going on there too. That helps. So I think it's looking good. It feels pretty good. I'm painting a real rosy picture because that's just my nature. But we've got our work cut out for us. I mean, the Trump administration is doing everything in their power, Hatch Act be damned, to use the power of federal resources and taxpayer dollars to bribe rural residents into voting for Donald Trump. I mean, the farm payments are astounding, and it's still not making farmers whole. And so I think these are the things that we have up against us, and we can't relent. And so I don't think we're curing our rural problem this cycle, but I think we're working to make it better, and we're working in the long term to make it better, so we don't have sort of the last 10 years repeated ad nauseum until we're all no longer here.
Well, and the other thing that I want to remind people, we didn't get here in a cycle. We're not going to work out of this in a cycle. And they say, well,
Yeah.
we'll never get them back. And I said, we've lost the generation that understood that FDR was absolutely essential to saving the family farm. And those folks have been with us for a long time. We haven't transitioned our dialogue with rural America in a way that would tell them that we're on their team and on their side. And so I look forward, and so I want to just do a quick transition here, Libby, to talk about what happens after the election. And I'm superstitious, so I don't like jinxing anything, but I do also think that it's so important to hit the ground running. And if in fact Joe Biden becomes the next president of the United States, uh, the work in rural America, and we see some of that is because, as the economist said, we're losing less badly in rural America. that's not good enough for us, and I know it's not good enough for you. How do we then propel the next cycle of messages? What would you recommend to anyone who is now looking at 2022 and saying, what does rural America, what can we do to reestablish our relationship with rural voters going forward after this election?
Sure. I think the first thing is we have to show up. I mean, for far too long, we didn't show up, we being like the royal we here in the National Democratic Party, didn't show up in rural America and took those voters that we did have there for granted and sort of wrote off. I think Democrats have a little bit of a policy arrogance sometimes where we assume because we think our policy is better for those folks. If they don't see it that way, then we're done talking. And I think that's the most reckless thing that you can do when trying to win back a whole constituency like you are with rural. So I think in order to not end up in the same problem that we did 10 and 12 years ago, we need to, and I have all the confidence that President Joe Biden can do this, to continue to fund the programs that we know are working with our state parties. If we want Democrats to be strong in rural states, we need to fund the state parties so that they can recruit candidates and run qualified, great people with some support on their at their back. And we need to tout, of course, Joe Biden's policy points, and of course what he's going to do as president for rural America. But having him show up in rural areas is so important too, and just showing that we're a big party tent. There can be lots of opinions, lots of disagreeing opinions, and that we welcome folks who might be a little more conservative but align with us, and we want you here, and that we value middle America in particular, and just sort of living our values, and making sure that we're encouraging the folks who are in these communities. As well as I do how frustrating it can be to be a Democrat, a little blue dot living in a very red sea. And the necessary evil is that as a national party, we have to look at the battleground states when we're up for a presidential election. And it can certainly make some of the states like North Dakota, like Wyoming, like Kansas, feel a little overlooked. And the way to cure that is to make sure that in the off cycles that we're investing in programs that help get Democrats elected here. But also, we can't be a toxic brand to rural America. We have to have policies that are middle of the road. We have to recognize that farmers have a different lens on issues like climate change. Doesn't mean they're less supportive, but we got to talk about, we got to figure out the way to talk to them and with them in a way that convinces them that our policy is correct. And there's lots of work to do, and we just can't take our foot off the gas on November 4th. Although I probably will take a big nap on November 4th and then get started again November 5th.
So I want to tell you about a conversation. I've obviously had a great opportunity to be on ag radio across the country. That's where the Biden campaign has sent me. I talk farmer better than Joni Ernst. I will say that. And so when you look at the conversations that I've had when they turn off the microphone and I say, "How do you think it's looking?" I had a really interesting conversation in Iowa. And I said, well, obviously Iowa had been trending blue, now is purple, then went to red. Now we're hoping that Joe Biden can win Iowa. We have 3 congressional districts that are currently represented by Democrats, and this really prominent ag radio guy said, look, it started out the Abby Finkenauer and Cynthia Axne basically didn't win. I mean, they were able to win because they represent some urban areas as well, kind of like a Fargo area. But after they won, and during the natural disasters in Iowa, during all of the kind of work that they've done, constituent outreach, he said they show up everywhere. He said they're in the farm country, they're in the VFWs, they're in the American Legions. They come down and they do meetings there. They really have done a great job reaching out. And his inclination was to say that because they showed up, they have softened any kind of criticism of their brand, their personal brand, but also carried that Democratic banner into rural America, and that's made all the difference. And so that was an interesting story that kind of supports what you and I are saying, which is it's not enough to win elections and say now we're done. We've got to continue the work that you started and the work that One Country started, and all of the other groups that are reaching out. I've spent some time with all of your rural coalitions that you formed, Libby, in various states. Amazing groups of people working really hard for common sense rural policies that are being promoted by the Democrats. So, you know, the argument I think we'd have to make, and especially in some of these mixed districts, is if you want an easier time in reelection, you got to get out there and you got to visit and you got to talk about what matters to people. And I expect that we can erode some of that huge advantage that the Republican Party has right now. So we just have a few minutes left. Do you have any final kind of pitches you want to make there, Libby?
Oh, you bet I do. Yeah, just here before I make my iwillvote.com pitch, I want to say too, you mentioned egg radio, and of course, in addition to having surrogates and elected officials and folks like you, Heidi, who can talk rural as well as anyone, because you live it. As well, in addition to those folks going on radio, the Biden campaign listened to the suggestions of you talked about our big coalition of rural folks, listen to suggestions that they made and are advertising on ag radio. And that seems like a no-brainer to rural folks, but this is kind of groundbreaking in terms of a Democratic presidential candidate making a significant advertising buy onto rural radio, right in time for the harvest about a month and a half ago. So farmers are sitting in their tractors and their cabs, listening to Biden's plan for rural America, which I think is awesome. And of course, we can't end this without getting a dig in at Joni Ernst. You mentioned that can talk about agriculture a little better than she does, but I know that for a fact that you know the price of soybeans and corn, Heidi. So I'm not saying it's a low bar, but that's pretty much political malpractice in Iowa to not know those two things going into a debate. But
Well, I have to tell you, Libby, old habits die hard. There's three things I check every morning. I check the price of oil because we're an oil producing state, along with that, natural gas. But I check the price of soybeans and I check the price of corn because that's going to determine whether people have smiles on their face or whether they're stressed out. And so,
yeah.
um, I get a dig in, but it does really speak volumes, I think, and anyone who wants to understand kind of rural America, watch that exchange. And Teresa Greenfield did a great job responding exactly probably the way I would have, which is it depends on where you are and what your input prices are. Some farmers who don't carry any debt may have it will have a much lower break even, but it was kind of fun to watch because somebody who is self-styled, I'm a girl from the farm, and I think even the commentator said, really, you grew up in a farm, you're a farm kid, you should know this. And I thought, yep, you should.
Yep, you should. Yeah, and I think the bummer for me was that the clip on Twitter that went around was just of Senator Ernst's answer. When you're right, Teresa Greenfield had a perfect answer and exactly what you should when you're representing the people of Iowa. So I hope that turns out. But to your point about my pitch, I want to make sure. I think one of the things that we've been better about this cycle than in previous cycles is making sure folks have correct information on where to vote, and then making sure that folks have that we have a robust voter protection team. And when I say robust, I mean very, very robust, to make sure that we're not make sure that we're fighting back against voter suppression, and never more important than now with the time of COVID and mail-in ballots and folks feeling a little skittish because our opponents will do and say anything to try and get them to not vote. But one of the things, the tools that we rolled out is iwillvote.com, and it's just an incredibly comprehensive and accurate source of voting information. We have an entire team dedicated to updating it in real time, so you can see when additional polling sites have been opened, or extended voting hours, or sort of all of the information you need to vote. You can request a ballot there. You can request a prepaid return envelope in states where that is allowed. And you can see all the info on voting for every state in the union. And all in one stop shop. You just enter your address and it'll take you through these tools. So if you're getting questions, if you're organizers who are on making phone calls, or if you got a question from your grandma or your aunt or your brother, I always get questions from my brother. He can't help himself about where to vote, how to vote. You can send them to iwillvote.com, and that's genuinely the most up to date information that anyone has, and we want people to use it.
Well, I mean, I just am so excited. I'm so grateful that you've been willing to take on this challenge. I know, it's never easy to make a career out of this kind of political work, and it takes a level of dedication that I know you got from your family because they are patriots as well. But Libby, you're a jewel, and I wish you a long nap, but not too long after this is all over. And, we'll have plenty of time to do a postmortem. And I hope that you'll come back on the hot dish with me to do a postmortem on what we learned and how we can, in fact, go immediately into the next cycle, talking about policy and talking about how we are going to bring that democratic message to rural America once again.
I would love to, Senator. And I keep making the joke about how I talk to you more than I talk to my husband or my parents. But in an election year, that just feels right. So I wouldn't have it any other way. But thank you for the work you're doing and for touting the gospel of Democrats in rural America.
Thank you so much, Libby. You have a great day.
You too.